person. And so what I'm going to do is give you a talk that's about a project that I've been working on for about 12 months, pretty much entirely remotely, that was funded by the ESRC under the Secondary Data Analysis Initiative. And the project is all about the geography of housing careers, understanding the geography of housing careers. And before I go any further, I'll just acknowledge the co-investigator on the project, Paul Longley, who's particularly involved with some of the big data work I'll discuss later on, and a series of research fellows who've been involved in particular parts of the work. So Joanna, Bin and Justin, who's been particularly involved in compiling the linked consumer registers, I'll say a lot more about in due course. So just a sort of acknowledgement of their contributions to this. And so this is how I'm going to speak for the next sort of 35-40 minutes. I'm going to just give you a bit of a background to the project. What's the aim and the kind of the purpose of the research. There are two strands of work under the project kind of overall sort of design of the project. There's a strand of survey research, and I'll give you a kind of a flavour of some of that work, but I won't say too much about it, because I want to devote most of the time to discussing our work on consumer data set that we are trying to see if we can use as a resource for kind of population and housing analysis. So one of the aims of this project was to scope the housing data landscape and try to see whether or not consumer data can be a useful resource for population and housing analysis. So I'll talk a little bit about a data set called the linked consumer registers. Explain a little bit about how we're going about enriching this resource for housing analysis particularly. So we're linking this resource to some Zoopla data on private rental vacancies, so some big data from Zoopla, and linkage more recently to energy performance certificate data, which allows us to explore dwelling size. So we know how many people are living at a particular address and the size of a unit, which is quite kind of useful information for gauging size adjustments in particular sectors of the housing system. And I'll wrap up with a summary and some next steps. So you're probably getting a sense at this point that this isn't a paper in the sense of here's a research question, here's a data set, here's an answer. This is much more of a description of a kind of a series of bits of work that we're doing in UCL Geography under this title, where we're trying to generate some new evidence about housing careers and understand the data landscape as well in more depth. Okay, so what are the kind of aims of the project, and what's the background to the project? So this is kind of the conceptual framework that I'm working in anyway, as a kind of housing researcher. So at the centre of the framework is housing behaviour, so people's movements between dwellings and neighbourhoods over the life course, and we've got around the edge of the diagram we've got kind of four large-scale macro level, I suppose, drivers of changes and patterns in residential behaviour. So we've got changes in the economy, both within the labour market, but also the housing system and the housing market. We've got changes in demographic structures, so things linked to processes linked to kind of the second demographic transition, but also kind of patterns of migration, having implications for housing demands and housing behaviours. We've got the kind of cultural setup of a given society and the way that's developed over time. So, for example, sort of particular orientation towards certain tenures that's arisen over time. And at the bottom, we've got kind of public policy developments, which influence housing behaviour in a huge range of ways. So people's access to resources, but also, particular interventions changing the kinds of tenures, opportunities and constraints people might encounter. So we've got these four macro level drivers influencing kind of housing behaviours through a range of different mechanisms. So we've got changes in preferences and aspirations. We've got the kind of resources and restrictions people experience. We've got if there are events and transitions that occur in people's life courses, and the broader scale geography of opportunities and constraints. So related to things to do with housing, but also related to the labour market and other kinds of important processes that go on in people's lives. So that's my kind of conceptual framework. And within that, we know that housing behaviours, residential behaviours have changed a lot since the 1990s, really. And I've got a number of kind of key trends up here on the side, and I'm not going to talk through those in a lot of detail because these are so often kind of discussed now that I don't think we need to spend a lot of time on them. But essentially, we've got trends in kind of access to own occupation, so taking longer to access own occupation, probably increased stratification of who is able to buy a housing, and increased reliance on intergenerational transfers, so those kind of life course linked lives assuming increased significance. And on the other side, we've got reduced access and reduced stock of social housing, and a kind of increased in patterns of prolonged private renting. So we know that these are kind of some broad scale changes in kind of the housing behaviours people are experiencing. And we can set this within the policy context. There's a lot of policy, these kind of issues crop up in policy discussions in a lot of detail. So in the last 3 years, we've had a couple of housing white papers from both the May government and more recently from the Johnson government in 2020, in summer 2020. And both of and if you read through the documents, both of these are kind of picking up on the same recurring themes. So there's a concern for access to own occupation, and there's a concern linked to that for generational inequity and the way that housing may be kind of increasing generational divisions, both in terms of space, sort of access to tenures, but also kind of wealth accumulation prospects as well. So less fortunate younger generation, essentially, and an older generation that benefited from a kind of more favourable context. So some recurring themes coming through, at least at Westminster level, and I'm aware that this is not the same in the devolved administrations, and that's part of the reason why we're interested in the geography of housing careers as well. So I think to sort of just link to that, one of the main sort of gaps in our understanding of kind of housing careers is really about the interlinkages between variations across time and space. So we know a lot about variation across time in terms of what different cohorts have been doing, and we know a bit about the housing market and how that varies across space, but we don't kind of know how time and place come together to shape housing careers, really. So some examples of work done on this outside of the academy by the Resolution Foundation. Lindsay Judge has been really active in this area in recent years, publishing a range of things on housing access. So you'll see charts like the one on the left quite frequently, sort of cohort patterns of home ownership, how those have changed over time. So from the baby boomers who sort of experienced faster entry to own occupation, ended up on a higher absolute rate of own occupation, down to the purple line, which are the millennials, who've taken longer to buy housing and probably in the Resolution Foundation's view won't ever get to the kind of levels of own occupation that the baby boomers did. And some geographical analysis broken down on the right from the labour force survey that Lindsay and Adam did a few years ago, where although there's regional differentiation, actually there is a clear kind of overall secular trend in over time, home ownership rates among younger adults declining across the board, really, particularly in London initially, but then subsequently in other regions as well. And a range of economic and life course drivers of those processes. So changes in access to an occupation, but also in kind of demand for an occupation as well, and people's ability to afford and have the economic security to buy housing. So this is the kind of context we're working in. So what our aim really overall was basically just to understand a bit more about the geography of housing careers, and particularly the home ownership as a kind of focal point. So we're particularly interested in home ownership, but we're also quite interested in private renting, as there's much less known about that. And we're interested in kind of understanding housing careers. And if we're working in housing careers, we need to be careful how we define those. So the definition is really quite simple. It's just a sort of succession of housing and neighbourhood states people pass through over the life course. So the idea here is that place is an important component of housing careers. So it's not enough just to look at dwelling units. We also need to know where those are situated as well. We're assuming that careers are conceptualized more as they are in life course research. So we're not thinking in terms of linear upward progression, but more in terms of perhaps non-linear pathways through the housing system. So we're not assuming upward progression. And although we're focusing on objectively measured attributes, the idea is that if we know about objectively measured attributes, then that gives us a sense of the kind of the context for the more subjective pathways, emotional pathways people are following over time. So engaging here with some of David Clapham's work, which is a bit more on the sort of subjectivity of housing. And some of the key variables that we kind of are interested in terms of housing careers are sort of tenure, size, and sort of space and neighbourhood attributes. So that's kind of an overall aim of the project, and it's embedded into a broader program of work in the Consumer Data Research Centre, based partly in UCL Geography, which is about population, housing and infrastructure. A lot of this work is engaging more with kind of the built environment, and our project is much more about people and seeing whether or not we can leverage consumer data as an alternative source for understanding how people move through the housing system over time. So here's just a sort of a kind of a snapshot overview of what the research design looks like. Basically in the middle, we've got what we want, where we want to be. We want to understand housing careers, and what we want to generate some new empirical evidence about what's going on with the geography of housing careers in the UK. But more importantly, perhaps, and particular focus of the project itself was to generate a better understanding of the data landscape. So the data resources that we can use to understand housing careers, their strengths, their weaknesses, and how we can kind of combine them either directly through data linkage, but also through kind of sensitive research design using different data sources for different kinds of research questions. So we want to generate a better understanding of the data landscape, essentially, going forward. And this is something where housing research has traditionally been quite poor at kind of creating a better understanding of different data sets and how they can be used to answer different questions. So one of the aspects of the study is obviously drawing on survey data, which have a lot of really attractive advantages for us. So we have kind of a scientific design that ensures that we have rich variables in our study that are useful for us, and those are gathered from actually interacting with people. We can be sure that the data are much more likely to be kind of representative of the population. Obvious limitations for geographical analysis. We have problems of sample size that we will encounter. So if you're working with survey data often and you want to do something on very detailed spatial scales, that's actually often very difficult. And that can be a major constraint, particularly for engaging with users. Because time and again, I go to knowledge exchange events and I'm talking to people in MHCLG and the Greater London Authority, and they want to know about local patterns. And it's very difficult to provide that evidence with many survey data sets. We just don't have the sample size to do that. And that's where the big data work comes in. So what we want to do in this project is get a sense of whether big data can actually help us in any way, big consumer data specifically, to understand housing. And this has been something that's been discussed for about 10 years. There's been a lot of literature on the kind of the new era of big data that we're entering, and the way in which that gives us granularity and frequently updated data sets, so we can get a much more real-time picture of what's going on at a very detailed spatial scale. On the converse to that, the counter argument is that as the more you delve into these the literature on this and kind of the findings, we become acutely aware of the kind of the disadvantages of taking this kind of approach. So particular concerns around provenance of data resources and whether or not they're representative. So what their population coverage is a major issue, and it's often uncertain, and that's a major problem for us as researchers. And just the messiness and the complexity of the data that we're working with as a barrier to actually generating new knowledge is not something to be underestimated, as I'll sort of come on to say a bit more about it in due course. So I often think what we can do here is when we're working with these kinds of complicated data sets, we're trying to understand them, we need to think back to what Donald Rumsfeld said in 2002. Okay, so before the Iraq War. So this is this very famous Rumsfeld quote where he talks about, as we know, there are known knowns, things we know, and that's great, that's where we want to be. But we also know there are known unknowns. That's to say there are some things we know that we don't know. And there's also unknown unknowns, which are the most problematic because they are things we don't know that we don't know. So what we want to do in our kind of assessment procedure is we want to move from kind of the known unknowns, we want to turn them into things that we actually know. So particularly issues around data coverage, data representation, and the gaps in data. So what we want to do is take some of these big consumer data sets and work out what they can be used to do and what perhaps they can't be used to do, or what are the biases in them. So we need to turn kind of things that we suspect are problems with them into knowledge itself. So we need to document the bias, the problems, the coverages as well. And maybe also generate some kind of new knowledge about questions as well. So that's our objective. So what I'm going to do is just quick introduction to some of the survey work that we've been doing, and then move on to discuss the way that this links to the consumer data work that we are continuing to do as well. So the consumer data, the survey data work kind of started from after discussions with a kind of advisory group. The thing that people most wanted to know early on in the project was, what are some of the broad regional patterns in home ownership over time, and how do these vary among people that entered the housing system at different points in time? So looking at broad brush regional patterns among cohorts was something that was of interest to kind of some of our advisors. So we start the project just to generate some useful benchmark information about regional patterns and the ways these vary. So we turned here to some data that the Resolution Foundation have used in the past, the Labour Force Survey, and longitudinal data from BHPS Understanding Society. So we've got about 27, I think, waves when this was done of data from BHPS, 18 waves of BHPS, 9 waves of Understanding Society, the follow-up survey to BHPS. And what we're doing is we want to know, both of those surveys collect information about who's the legal owner of a dwelling and whether a person in a housing unit actually owns the unit, and that's our kind of dependent variable we're interested in. So we're interested in legal contractual ownership of the dwelling a person is living in. So not whether or not they're in an owner-occupied household, but whether or not they are actually the owner of the unit that they live in. That's our outcome. And what we do is we started off with using kind of 4 kind of 7-year birth cohorts, looking at their trajectories and transitions of ownership, and they're sat out on the slide here. So we're tracking these individuals in these cohorts when that cohort's youngest members become 18. So they're 7-year birth cohorts. So we enter our study the first year that the youngest people are aged 18. And we had to combine some of the regions together according to broad housing market characteristics to get a sense in order to boost the sample up enough to generate some robust findings. So I'll say a little bit first about the LFS work, and then I'll move on to some of the transition work. And this is very much a kind of a quick summary of some of the most interesting things that sort of emerged. So we began by just looking at the ownership trajectory. So very much in the vein of Call it and Judge that I put the graphs up from before, looking at how the rates of home ownership among these different cohorts have changed over time. So the oldest cohort, the 67 to 73 cohort, shown in the green line, down to the pink line here, which is the most recent cohort, the 88 to 94 cohort. And the advantage of breaking cohorts up into kind of smaller number of years is really that we can see pattern temporal change on a finer grained way, finer grained level. So what we've got is percentage homeowners on the y-axis, and the x-axis is kind of the middle age of that cohort at a particular point in time. So the cohorts are starting off at 21, which is when the youngest members are aged 18. So it's kind of quite simplistic approach here. But we can see a number of things. So first of all, we can see there's a clear cohort trend going on across the country. So the faster entry into owner occupation among the older cohorts, going down slower entry among the 81 to 87, and slightly different among the 88 to 94 cohort, which I'll say a little bit in a minute. So there's a clear cohort trend, and that seems to be kind of happening basically across the board, but in slightly different ways. So London and the South, there's much clearer differentiation among the 2 older cohorts. So that process of kind of delayed entry, lower levels of occupation in early adulthood started a bit earlier in London and the South. If you look at the North and Wales and Scotland, the green and the orange line are on the same trajectory until about the age of 30 when they start diverging. And it's interesting that happens around the age of 30 because that's when the global financial crisis was. So that cohort was entering kind of trajectory seems to have been slightly kind of derailed a little bit potentially by the crisis occurring in 2008-9. Final point, the one that's perhaps most interesting, is the need to disaggregate among the millennial cohorts. The millennials often taken as those born after 1980 or 1981 through to 2000, and actually these groups are not the same. So the kind of those born 1981 to 87, it's my peers essentially, have a very linear trajectory, whereas the more recent cohorts, actually there's a stronger uptick among this cohort in more recent years, particularly among the less expensive parts of the country in the South, where they're actually surpassing their predecessor at the same age, which probably attributes to a very relaxed credit environment in recent years. Very easy, much more easy to get mortgages than it was at the same point in the life course for the previous cohort, and also potentially the effects of kind of help to buy support as well, which this cohort have benefited from sort of throughout the early adulthood. We then go on to do a bit of modeling work, and again, this isn't the place to go into too much detail about that, but essentially what I'm showing here is a series of logistic regression models where our outcome variable is the transition into owner occupation between the wave t and t+1. So we're moving to the longitudinal data, we're modeling that transition to ownership as our outcome. And what we fit is a series of different logistic regressions. So we fit them for different cohorts, and that's what's shown in the rows here of the panel. And we fit them across different parts of the life course. So we're restricting we're trying to cover the same part of the life course. So we're tracking each cohort for 5 waves after it's aged 18 to 24, 12 waves, 19 waves, and 26 waves to cover longer and longer periods of the life course where possible. So this essentially maps onto early 20s to mid 20s. This is late 20s, early 30s, through the 30s and into the 40s essentially. And we can only track the older cohort for that long with the data we've got. In general, what we get, the findings we get are actually there's not that much regional variation going on. It's fairly minor, kind of in terms of magnitude of regional variation. And London is the main difference, perhaps unsurprisingly. Slower entries into an occupation in London seems to be a fairly common finding, although that wears off for the 1967 to 73 cohort as we move through the life course. But for the other cohorts, consistent pattern is significantly slower entries into an occupation across the life course for people living in the capital, which we can put down to probably price, kind of affordability issues, but also probably selective out migration from London. So people who particularly want to buy a house will be moving out of London in order to kind of be able to afford somewhere to live. So that's some just a quick assessment of some of the regional disparities. And the main finding is that actually London is the main difference at the regional scale in terms of the kind of housing careers people are experiencing. There's a lot of control variables in these models as well, and the effects are very consistent with what we'd expect from the literature. So income, jobs, etc., having very effects that are not surprising. So how are we building on this? Well, the first thing we're trying to do is actually integrate neighborhood into our kind of modeling approach in more detail. So not just modeling owner occupation, but actually looking at where people are buying and owning. So using deprivation as a way of gauging whether people are buying more advantaged or less advantaged locations. That's a really important goal for us in the project, is getting that in neighborhood and housing type integrated together. Some regional variation in housing career sequences. Again, that's something that's of interest. So to what extent, not just transitions, but actually career structures overall vary spatially across the country is something that's really interesting and particularly useful when we start moving to the big data work. And originally we had quite a large focus on wealth, but that, after conversing with some of our stakeholders, has been sort of downgraded as a priority. It's not quite as important as tenure, transitions, and where people are living in our kind of stakeholders' views. And the whole point of the survey work is really to kind of give us an idea of some questions we want to ask of the big data, and also to give us a sense of some of the benchmarks we should be looking for. What are some of the patterns we should be expecting when we come to compile and understand our consumer big data resources? And this is where the stakeholders are particularly interested in understanding things. So how the MHCLG, but also the GLA, kind of quite keen on understanding how we can harness consumer resources to understand local patterns and of housing sort of transitions and careers. So I'll move now on to discuss this, and this has been for me on a personal level, this has been a big transition for me, moving from a world of survey data that I'm quite comfortable with, quite familiar with, into a landscape of particularly consumer big data. Has been a major transition in my own life course, I think, in terms of research work. So the raw data that we are mainly drawing on in this strand of work is something called the Linked Consumer Registers, or the LCR data set, that's been compiled by Paul and Justin and the colleagues over a number of years, probably about 5-6 years now. They've been working on this. And this data resource basically is drawn from the public electoral roll and consumer sources. So there are various commercial organizations that supply information on names and residential addresses of people. So they compile them from the electoral roll and from consumer sources, and then CDRC invests in them essentially, and we end up with a database. So the idea is that this database, the LCR database, contains about 2 billion records, so 50 million records a year, and each row essentially is a name and an address associated with that name for that particular year. And the raw information from that is drawn from the electoral rolls that people register for if they're eligible to vote, and a range of consumer sources, so consumer information. The blend of electoral roll and consumer sources changes over time, and particularly since electoral opt-out was introduced, so people can opt out of the public electoral roll. And when that happens, there's more reliance on kind of consumer sources. So commercial organizations know your address and sell that on. There's more information on that. And a major problem, a major issue for us, and one that Paul's team have been grappling with, is that the provenance of the consumer sources is not known. It's just a commercially sensitive information, so we don't know where the consumer source is, what raw data those are based on. Are they based on student loan information, nectar cards? We don't know what information is going into the composition of the consumer sources. So what Paul and his team have been doing is firstly kind of georeferencing all of this information, so matching messy address information to various products, address-based premium and the postcode address file, in order to create a consistent database of addresses, and then linking that to some information from the Land Registry and the Registers of Scotland on housing transactions data. So once we've got the addresses people are known to be living at in various years, we can link that to transactions information in order to see where housing sales have occurred. And that's useful because those transactions are an indicator of changes in people living in an address. So we can take a presence of a transaction as often inferring that some mobility has gone on. But it's also interesting for us as housing researchers because it gives us information about kind of sales prices and what type of units people are living in. And what Paul and Justin have been doing is then taking each of these annual data sets and linking them together to create a kind of a linked register where we have rows of data that represent particular names and addresses and the date at which that individual was seen at that particular address. So this creates what we call the linked consumer register, and that's got about 150 million rows-ish, and it's constantly changing, constantly being updated, but at the moment that's where we are, I think, with this data resource. And there's also some longitudinal linkage that's been gone on, where Paul and his team have used name combinations observed at addresses and transitions in those to look at people leaving and joining different addresses to create kind of probabilistic models of longitudinal changes. So where people are going, creating a probabilistic model of predicting where people are going between addresses. When they're seen to leave an address, where do they go? And this is far from an exact science, and it's kind of still something that Paul's team are kind of working on. And if you want to know more about that, the Lansley paper, there's a paper by Guy Lansley in the Journal of the Royal Statistical Society 2019 that is the most useful resource. So I wasn't actually involved in the creation of the original data resources. So I'm kind of, I rely on that and the kind of the documentation they provided for a detailed understanding of how this linkage was done. And it's very computationally intensive and it's taken a long time. Very useful. Once we've got this indicator, the linked consumer register, what we can do, what they've done is creating a churn index. So looking at the percentage of addresses in a particular small geographic scale, like an LSOA scale, where the occupants have changed since a given reference date. And we can use this to look at changes in residential addresses, changes in addresses over time in different areas since the last census. So we've got population churn since the last census here on this map. The red values more churn and the blue values less churn going on. And what's really nice about this is that you can look at local level patterns and pick up some of the changes that have been gone on due to urban restructuring since 2011. So in London, for example, around the Stratford area, there's been a lot of population change since 2011, linked to the redevelopment after the Olympics. Particular areas in Islington here that I know quite well. These are areas where there's been a lot of redevelopment. So this is a really nice data resource for like local level analysis of population change. So how do we go from that to actually housing careers? And what we're doing in the project is really kind of enriching the LCR data set, so that data set of names and addresses, with a lot of housing information in order to create a resource that we hope can be used to gauge housing careers in some way. And here's a sort of schematic of how we're going about it. So we've got a range of input data sets. So domestic energy performance data, that's open data, available, I think, for England at the moment, but hopefully for Scotland in due course. So there's information on energy performance certificates. That gives us information on dwelling size that we can use. We got some information from the Land Registry and Registers of Scotland on housing transactions, and Zoopla data on listings in the PRS, in the private rented sector, which we can use to gauge whether or not a property is being advertised as for private rent, and also get a sense of rental information as well. So kind of integrating all of these resources together, matching based on addresses to create what we hope is going to be a linked consumer register, where every name and address, piece of name and address information is supplemented with information on dwelling size and sales info and rental vacancies if available. This looks great, looks really straightforward and neat and nice, but it's nothing like that in reality. And it's taking a very long time to produce this, this resource, particularly since the transition to fully remote working. So just an example address record, some of the information we could know about an address. So from the Land Registry, we can know dates of sales and the sales prices. From EPCs, we can know the amount of rooms in dwelling and the floor space, which is information that we very rarely get, is kind of meters squared of housing space. And from Zoopla, we get information on rental levels and also more supplementary information on kinds of rooms that a unit's been advertised for. And from this, we can kind of gauge tenure at particular points in time. So we know this unit is entering the private rented sector probably around 2012. So we can give some measure of tenure here with a reasonable degree of precision. So the first thing to do before we can actually use any of this is to kind of validate and do some validation work, checking some of the patterns we see in the data against what we know is going on from other data resources. And here we're relying still quite heavily on the 2011 census. What we're trying to do is work out how useful the Zoopla listings are as an indicator of residential change in the private rented sector. So we've got some Zoopla data, Zoopla listings from 2014-2019, relating the number of listings to the amount of mobility that we know happened in 2011 in the private rented sector. So the right-hand side, we can see the correlations at the local authority level, which are generally extremely strong, but with lower levels of Zoopla as opposed to the census. So Zoopla undercounts private rented sector moves, but the correlation between Zoopla listings and PRS moves is very strong indeed. And the outliers here are kind of unusual areas, like places in kind of central London and places that have very distinctive housing markets. The map shows kind of the distribution geographically, so how listings and census mobility kind of line up to each other. And we can see, there are some parts of the country that Zoopla listings to cover better. Home counties particularly good. Some of the kind of northern parts of England and places where the coverage is less good. Although most of these are areas where the private rented sector is really small, so that's not a major concern to us. So overall, Zoopla listings look like being a reasonably good indicator at an aggregate scale of the amount of private rented mobilities that are going on for us. We can link the Zoopla listings to the LCR using firstly the address information in both data sets, and in the LCR, the dates in which people are observed at particular addresses. So we can link on a Zoopla record where we know there's been an occupant has changed at a given address in a year. And if we do that, we end up with a map, a pattern shown as shown on the left-hand image here. So how many of the Zoopla records that are matching to the linked consumer registers? It's about 25% overall, which seems quite low, but when you think about the criteria we're using in this first matching process are actually quite stringent. So Zoopla listing has to occur at exactly the same year at which the LCR observes a change in person, which is quite unlikely. We know people don't register on the electoral roll immediately. We know consumer organisations are not going to pick up changes in occupants on a very fine temporal geographical scale. And on the right-hand side is perhaps slightly less informative, just the percent of the LCR that has a Zoopla listing. So where is the private rented sector most represented? Well, actually, it generally looks like sort of towns with large student populations, parts of London and the surrounding areas. So this is all making sense to us. Kind of Zoopla seems to be a reasonably good indicator of the amount of change that's going on in the private rented sector. Although clearly there's a lot of work to be done. Varying the dates to see how well we can kind of match Zoopla listings to particular residential change events. We can also look at dwelling space changes, and this is just some experimental work we've been doing, looking at moves within the unoccupied sector, which is where we can be most confident that we're actually picking up the correct changes in a residential address, because we have transactional information in the unoccupied sector, and we also have EPC data on which gives us information on space, but also a good indicator of whether or not moves taken place as well. So we can identify in the data about 6.8 million moves of households between owned dwellings, I think 2008 onwards. There's a very large number of kind of household moves between owned occupied dwellings, and in general these lead people to have slightly more housing space than they had previously. So more moving up in terms of space than down in terms of space, which kind of fits with what we know. But actually, if we look at the distribution, most of the changes in residential space are kind of fairly minor in terms of their magnitude. So most people making quite small adjustments in terms of housing space. We can look at the geography of moves, and this is all just kind of for illustrative purposes. I wouldn't take these results as gospel because they've been produced specifically for this presentation rather quickly, but they're a useful kind of indicator of what we can do with the data. So we can take origin regions in the panels, and we can look at the proportion of people moving to a larger unit who move to a different region or stay in the same region. We can see that most of the kind of moves that go on are within the region. So most of the upsizing goes on within regions, and London is notably lower proportion. So there's a high outflow of people from London to the southeast and east when they're buying and moving to a larger unit. So sort of those flows are kind of as we'd expect, from our knowledge of kind of the residential geography of the UK, and downsizing moves as well. We can look at downsizing, and here London features much more strongly. London's in the top 5 destinations, which are the things along the x-axis here for us. London's in the top 5 destinations for most of the regions compared to the previous graph, where London didn't really feature in the kind of places that people were upsizing to. So useful information, we can combine information from the LCRs, we think, with data on transactions and EPCs to look at these changes in residential space, to look at within particularly the unoccupied sector with a reasonably high degree of precision. We can look also at the matrix of changes that are going on. So the transitions to larger units, where do people come from? So on the left, we've got an alluvial plot with the size origin, so the unit size at the origin and the size at the destination. We can look at where people are moving to, kinds of housing they're moving between when they go to a larger unit by region. We could do this for much finer grained geographic spaces. So there's at least 100,000 household moves in all of these kind of panels that are being shown here. So there's really huge amounts of data that we can use to look at upsizing and downsizing in its geography in a lot of detail. So some extensions to this before I sort of just wrap up. We've got a huge amount of linkage work to do. It's been a very complicated process. So the absence of consistent identifiers in UK data sets is a very big problem. Difficulties with address matching, not to be underestimated as well. There's a lot of work still to do linking the data, and BIN is at present beavering away on that, I think. We're trying to move now towards refining a measure of tenure based on the housing transactions data, what we know about the tenure structure of local areas, and doing a lot more work validating mobility patterns. So kind of the origin destination flows of different households. So Justin's working on that at the moment. I think there's a paper coming out in JRSSA on that as well soon. And we can do some comparison where we compare the sorts of transition patterns we see in the survey data with what we see in the big data at the regional level or above, which is somewhere where we hope to be going in the near future. So that's a kind of whistle stop of what we're doing in this project, where we're going. And so I'll just finish up with one quick slide on kind of thoughts that have come out of all of this work. So our kind of initial work on the initial analysis really suggests that basically the housing career story is mainly one of national patterns over time. There are regional variations, and they're very interesting. And London is the main place that's different, essentially, which is perhaps not a surprise. So London standing out as being the most significantly different region in terms of housing careers. Getting a better sense, I think, of the ways in which multiple data resources can be harnessed for understanding housing careers. And here it's important to note that big data are not by any means a kind of a magic bullet, a silver bullet that will sort of solve all our problems, as Chris Anderson wrote in Wired, I think, in a few years, in 2008. Big data are not going to, in this field anyway, completely supplement the census kind of data that we rely on and carefully designed social surveys. They have their advantages at the granular scale, but the amount of labor that needs to go into cleaning, preparing and checking, validating these resources is counterbalancing the velocity advantage that these data promise to give us. So this is something that Mark Livingston at Glasgow has written about recently, that the amount of time it takes to make sure that our data, to turn unknown bias into known bias, really counterbalances the velocity advantages on these data sets. They may, however, be really very useful for housing units than for people in the housing units. Housing units are fixed in space. They tend not to change too much over time. So if we can harness administrative and commercial data about the units, maybe that might be more valuable than perhaps analysis of people in the stock, which is proving to be quite challenging. Look out for some new CDRC data resources on this in the future. One of the things we're hoping to do is actually compile a detailed assessment of the utility of some of these data sets for housing research. I'm not sure what the conclusions of that will be, but either way, we want to publish some information on how useful these kind of data sets are. We're going to be hosting some kind of a online knowledge exchange kind of event as well in the next few months based on project research. So that's a kind of a whistle-stop tour of this particular project. It doesn't have a neat conclusion, which I really dislike when I present, but it's still important to, I think, showcase where we are. Thank you to the ESRC for the SDI funding. Thank you to a range of data providers who've been very instrumental in supplying these data and engaging with us as we make the transition from working in secure locations on campus to remote working, which has been not a straightforward process either. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing now, I think.